overall commander of Union forces are going into bloody Antietam?
McClellan.
Right, and who did he replace?
He replaced Henry Halleck.
Okay, so Halleck wasn't in command long because of his ineffectiveness, and historians will tell you that probably Lincoln probably shouldn't have switched McClellan for Halleck in the first place, or should have left things alone, but we'll see how it goes. Well, like we mentioned yesterday, when Lincoln replaced General Halleck with General McClellan, the South was very encouraged by their early successes, and so they decided for the first time to go on the offensive in the Civil War. They had always been defending to that point. And Confederate General Lee and his staff made the decision to try to do three key things at this point in the Civil War. They were going to try to regain control of the Mississippi River. They were going to try to recover lost ground that they had lost already in Kentucky and Tennessee, and then they were going to invade the border state of Maryland. So that takes us to bloody Antietam. Now, what's something you really need to understand is that there were some states that did not secede from the Union that really were trying to be neutral, and they were kind of considered themselves neutral. They were trying not to take a side. And the states at this time in the Civil War that were neutral were Maryland, Kentucky, even though they had been taken over by the Union forces, they were trying to remain neutral, Kentucky. Missouri was also trying to remain neutral. So Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware also was trying to remain neutral. And then think about what happened in Virginia. What other state was trying to remain neutral? West Virginia. So the 5 neutral states at this point in the Civil War were Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and West Virginia. Now, I told you that the Confederates were going to take the war kind of to the north and invade the neutral state or border state of Maryland. And there were 3 reasons why the Confederates wanted to win a victory in Maryland. Okay? 3 reasons why a victory in Maryland would be very important for them. And I said a victory in Maryland, okay? So the Confederates and General Lee are going to take the war to Maryland. They're going to go on the offensive, and they wanted to win a victory in Maryland for 3 reasons. Well, it might be one reason if they're going to Maryland that would be a benefit to them. Well, don't think that far ahead, not so much victory. We've got some neutral states. If they go in and win a victory in Maryland, what might Maryland do? Secede. Okay, so that was the first reason why they wanted a victory in Maryland. They thought a victory in that state might draw them into the Confederacy. They would secede and join their cause. Now, Nick said this to a point. The second reason they wanted a victory in Maryland is they thought a victory on what they considered Union soil, even though it was neutral, it really was Union soil because they were still a member of the Union, right? Might convince Lincoln to end the war. So they thought if they got a big victory in Maryland, which they considered Union soil, that President Lincoln might end the war. Now, what might Maryland have, number 3, that the Southern soldiers are lacking big time right now? No, not so much strategically, but survival.
Supplies.
Food. Okay, they were really desperately needing food. They're not growing a lot of food in the South, are they, while they're fighting? So they're getting kind of desperate for food, and Maryland had a supply of food. So they felt the third reason a victory in Maryland would be important is it would give the Southern soldiers access to food that they desperately needed. So, because of these 3 reasons and because of the change in philosophy, General Lee marches his Confederate troops from Richmond toward Maryland. Okay? He marches the Southern troops from Richmond towards Maryland. Now, the first thing the Confederates are going to do on the way to Maryland is they're going to seize the federal arsenal where? We talked about it before. They're going to seize the federal arsenal where? It belongs to the Union right now. Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So on the way, as they're marching, the Confederates are going to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And then they're going to march from Harper's Ferry to where? Where are they going?
Maryland.
Maryland. Now, something occurs on the march that's going to change maybe the course of American history. As the rebels are marching from Harper's Ferry, Virginia to Maryland to invade, a Union scout finds 3 cigars wrapped up in paper. So as the rebels are marching towards Maryland, a Union soldier that's scouting finds 3 cigars wrapped up in paper. Now, as he proceeded to unwrap the paper, because I think he was interested in smoking the cigars, he discovered that the paper had writing on it. So as he took the paper off to discard the paper from the cigars, because he had thoughts of smoking them, that would have been a luxury, I think, for him to find those cigars, he noticed that the paper had writing on it. And to his shock, the paper that had the writing on it, the writing was a detailed strategy of General Lee's plans for his assault on Maryland. So somebody dropped some pretty important information, probably either Lee himself or an officer, never really discovered. So this Union soldier who's scouting, keeping an eye on the rebels moving from Harper's Ferry, Virginia to Maryland, finds 3 cigars wrapped up in paper. He takes the paper off with the intention of smoking the cigars, and he notices there's writing on the paper. When he reads the writing, it is a detailed strategy of General Lee's plans for this assault on Maryland. So what does he do? He delivers that paper directly to General McClellan's headquarters. Okay? He delivers that paper directly to General McClellan's headquarters. What has been McClellan's biggest problem that Lee is discussing with? His reluctancy to attack and be aggressive. Well, with this information, McClellan's not going to at all be reluctant to attack the Confederates. He knows Lee's exact whereabouts. He knows General Lee's exact intentions. Okay, so he's not going to be reluctant at all. So, on September 17, 1862, September 17th, 1862, McClellan's Army of the Potomac met Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Antietam Creek, Maryland. So with these plans in hand, knowing exactly Lee's whereabouts and his intentions, on September 17th, 1862, McClellan's Army of the Potomac met Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Antietam Creek, Maryland. September 17th, 1862, McClellan's Army of the Potomac met Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Antietam Creek, Maryland. Lee's army consisted of 40,000 men. McClellan had a command of nearly 70,000. Lee's army, 40,000. McClellan's command, nearly 70,000. The Battle of Antietam lasted 1 full day, and casualties were high on both sides. The battle lasted 1 full day, and casualties were high on both sides. The combination of casualties, there were approximately 5,000 soldiers from both sides killed in the Battle of Antietam, and approximately 19,000 troops were wounded. That's a combination, okay? So 5,000 soldiers from both sides were killed, approximately 19,000 soldiers from both sides were wounded. So 24,000 casualties between the two in this one-day battle. Now, historians view the Battle of Antietam as a military draw, tie. Military draw or tie. But one side is going to gain more from the battle than the other. Although historians say that the Battle of Antietam was a military draw or tie, one side's actually going to gain advantages. Which side would that be? The Union. And there's 2 reasons why. First of all, Lee and the Confederates had to retreat back across the Potomac River out of Maryland. So Lee was the one that retreated. at the end of this battle. So really the Union held the ground. Didn't really get a victory, but they held the ground. So Lee and the Confederates had to retreat across the Potomac out of Maryland toward Richmond. And what did the Confederate Army fail to get? A victory on Northern Union or Northern soil. So although this battle was considered a military draw in Civil War history, the Union gained much more than the Confederates at Antietam. Lee and the Confederates were forced to retreat back across the Potomac River out of Maryland towards Virginia, and the Confederate Army failed to get that victory they so desperately needed on Northern soil. That'll take us to a very historic time in history, something called the Emancipation Proclamation. And my guess is that there always is a good chance there might be a question on the AP exam about this. So the Emancipation Proclamation. I gave you a copy of this. You don't have to pull it out, but you do have a copy of it that I put in your handouts the other day. Now, we got to kind of back up. In the summer of 1862, before the Battle of Antietam ever happened, President Lincoln assembled his cabinet together for a meeting. Okay? So in the summer of 1862, before Antietam ever occurred, Lincoln had assembled his cabinet together for a meeting. So it was before the Battle of Antietam that Lincoln informed his cabinet that he was considering issuing a proclamation that would free slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. So again, prior to the Battle of Antietam in the summer of 1862, President Lincoln assembled his cabinet for a meeting, and he told his cabinet that he was considering issuing a proclamation that would free all slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. Okay? So, what two areas did it not mention freeing of the slaves? The North and those 5 neutral states that didn't secede. So what he's doing with the proclamation is he's only freeing slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. How many of you thought he freed every slave in the country at the Emancipation Proclamation? Most people do. It only freed the ones that had seceded from the Union. Now, after this was discussed, Lincoln's cabinet agreed, but they said, we want to wait until we get a big Union victory in the war. It would be much better if we kicked butt and then announced it than we lost and announced it. So the reason why it hasn't happened yet, as our timeline goes in this lecture, is because that big Union victory hasn't occurred, in which Lincoln then would introduce the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, after discussion, Lincoln's cabinet convinced the president to wait to announce this proclamation until after a big Union victory. Well, after the Battle of Antietam, even though historians said it was a military draw, Lincoln thought it was enough of a victory to announce his plans. Okay? So even though the Battle of Antietam might have been considered a military draw, Lincoln thought it was enough of a victory that he could announce his plans. Okay, therefore, on January 1st of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which officially ended slavery where? The Confederate States. Don't say the South, because they're only Confederate States. Only the states that seceded from the Union. So don't get confused on that. So it officially ended slavery in the Confederate States. Now, there were 2 major reasons why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And it really doesn't have a damn thing to do with slavery, which is kind of ironic. So there are 2 major reasons Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. We kind of talked about one a little bit. I gave you a little prelude in the lecture. Anybody want to guess why he freed the slaves in the South?
To show foreign countries that they were fighting for slavery.
Very good, Buck. When he did that, the proclamation, he knew it would keep France and England out of the war, because they were very willing to help the South fight for states' rights or the right of a state to make its own decisions. But if they figured that if the South kept fighting when slavery became illegal, that they weren't fighting for states' rights, they were fighting for slavery. And Lincoln was smart enough to know that. So that was the big reason why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, was to keep France and England out of the war, because France and England were willing to help the South concerning the issue of states' rights, but could not support the issue of slavery and did not want to be associated as a country that supported such a thing. The second reason why he did it is Lincoln was having trouble within the Congress. That would be the House and the Senate. There was a group of, you'll hear about them later, radical Republicans that were really giving him the business. They were really on his case about slavery. They hated slavery, they hated the thought of slavery, and he thought if he passed the Emancipation Proclamation and freed all the slaves in the South and the Confederate States in the South, that it would quiet down some of their complaining, which it actually did to a point. So the two major reasons Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation was to quiet the protests in Congress by the radical Republicans, and two, to keep France and England out of the war. Did it have anything really to do with black people and slavery when you really think about it? Not really. That wasn't the reason he did it. It's because he felt sorry for slaves. He did it to quiet protesting in Congress by the radical Republicans and to keep France and England out of the war. Now, the positive thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is after it was passed, approximately 180,000 blacks fought on the Union side in the Civil War. Because what they do, they left their plantations and came north and fought on our side. So we gained about 180,000 black troops after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. So that was another advantage. Anybody know what those Negro soldiers were called? Buffalo soldiers. Kind of a racist thought, but that's what they were called, buffalo soldiers. And they were always commanded by white officers. Okay? So the Negro soldiers that fought on the North, for the North in the Civil War, were referred to as buffalo soldiers, and they were commanded by white officers. Now let me ask you a question. You have rules in war, don't you? Yeah. And if you capture somebody and make them a prisoner of war, you don't treat them very well. But can you imagine, do you think that the black soldiers, the buffalo soldiers that were captured by the Confederates, do you think they were given the same treatment as other prisoners of war? No, they were usually either shot or burnt to death on sight. So if they were captured, they didn't take them somewhere and put them in a Union, or excuse me, a Confederate, prison. They either shot them on sight or burned them to death on sight. That was not good. In addition, lots of times, if a white commander was commanding Negro soldiers or buffalo soldiers, and the white commander was caught, he often faced the same penalty of being shot or burned to death on spot. So there wasn't the same rules, unfortunately, for the buffalo soldiers, excuse me, than there were for the rest of them if they were caught. Here's your handout on the Emancipation Proclamation. We're not going to read it all today. I just want you to have a copy. You read it at your leisure. I think it'd be important to kind of read through it, and we'll get a little more into it before the test next year, but that's kind of what we'll do with that. It's kind of why I want you to keep these notebooks. Okay, that'll then take us to the Battle of Fredericksburg. Okay, the Battle of Fredericksburg. Well, Lincoln still isn't real pleased with his overall commander. So he was disappointed in General McClellan's leadership even after his military draw at Antietam. So he again replaced him. This time he chose General Ambrose Burnside to be overall commander of Union forces. Ambrose Burnside. So Lincoln's having quite a time, isn't he? And do you think this is helpful to the Confederate or the Union side that he keeps switching commanders? Not very good. So it's like switching head coaches every 3 months and trying to get a program going. Or every year. Yeah, you talk about years, yeah, whatever. But anyway, so getting on to a different subject. So Lincoln chose, but the point is, you know what that can do to a program? What can they do to a war effort? You're switching, everybody's got different ideas, okay? So, General Ambrose Burnside is the new commander. Now, Burnside has a plan, and his plan was to again attack the Confederates towards Richmond. And he wanted to attack the Confederates at Fredericksburg, Virginia. So Burnside gets together with his strategy. He again wants to make an assault on the Confederates in Virginia, this time Fredericksburg. This time Fredericksburg. And Burnside believes that the Union can march to Fredericksburg, win there, march to the capital of Richmond, and end the war once and for all. That's his strategy. We're going to quit messing around. We're marching straight to Fredericksburg. We're going to kick butt there. We're going to go straight to Richmond. We're going to end this thing. I'm tired of it. Well, Burnside was an interesting guy. He was a little more traditional. So on December 13th, 1862, on December 13th, 1862, and this is just prior to what? Emancipation Proclamation, because we're kind of going back and forth. Burnside led his Union troops on a frontal attack against the rebels, which means he marched his men in strict formation toward the Confederate soldiers at Fredericksburg. Little different strategy. Remember we talked about that. So, on December 13th, 1862, General Ambrose Burnside led his Union troops on a frontal attack against the rebels at Fredericksburg. The Union marched in strict formation toward the Confederate soldiers straight into rebel gunfire. As the Union is marching in strict formation, where are the Confederate soldiers? They're behind rocks, behind walls, buildings, trees. I mean, they're doing the guerrilla tactics. They're not standing up and boxing. They're doing a little bit of the guerrilla tactics. Well, it was a very short engagement. It was a crushing defeat for the Union. And the Union lost 12,000 soldiers to casualty in this very short battle. 12,000. With very few losses on the Confederate side because of the way it was fought. So again, the Confederate soldiers fired at these formation walking Union columns from behind rocks, walls, and buildings.